What is evolutionary psychology and why is it so important?
So, evolutionary psychology is really an approach to studying human behavior. I mean, the first thing is human behavior is super important. Elon Musk is throwing rockets up into space, and we're pretty good at that. But we're still not great at figuring out how to organize ourselves. I mean, look at the modern political context. So, evolutionary psychology gives us tools to understand human nature. And the main tool it uses is Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So, you're an animal, I'm an animal. We evolved to have certain preferences, desires, beliefs, patterns of behavior, so on. So, evolutionary psychology helps us develop hypotheses about human nature, about how the mind works. And it's important because, man, if you want to solve the world's problems, you got to understand human nature. You got to understand why people do what they do, what motivates them, what deters them, all that stuff. Also, it's really interesting.
What's the latest evidence challenging the former Darwinism approach? Is there anything that new that's happened that's changed the way we look at that?
A lot of the most recent developments have been in the context of genetics. So one big picture finding is that more and more people, and I among them, think that genetic changes have happened more recently. Like there have been a lot of genetic changes even in the last tens of thousands of years as opposed to millions of years. So that to some extent changes the way we think about things, right? So there's a lot of examples where the world has changed and what genes do better in those contexts. Therefore, it changes a little bit. But so genes are changed slowly, but maybe in humans, in some cases at least, they change faster than we thought. So don't get me wrong, the brains that we have are still brains that would have been really useful to have in human ancestral environments. Living in small groups of people where food was scarce, there were predators that could get you. There weren't millions of people in the world. There were, thousands or tens of thousands and later hundreds of thousands. So we're evolved for a very different world from the one that we're in today. And that has important consequences for the way we think about human behavior.
I think that's obvious, right? Like we're not meant to be living in this crazy, accelerated, fast-paced world with short form content and our eyes stuck to the visuals on our phone. So what are the changing bio cybernetic I guess implications of this IT infiltrated biology world that we live in?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so one area of study in here I have in mind my John Haidt, who just done some great work in this area. So one question you have, I think that makes a big difference is how are these minds that are so intensely designed to crave feedback from the social world, what are they going to do when they have this device which gives them likes and engagement and so on that they can turn to instead of doing other stuff like playing outside or doing their job? So we have these companies that have created devices that are really good at capturing our attention, which definitely, obviously they didn't exist until very recently. So one important question is what are the consequences for how people interact? What are the consequences for human well-being? What are the consequences for, the development of kids, when they've got their eyes on their phones instead of on the blackboard, what's going to happen? And this is, I think, again, a really good example of a mismatch between the modern world and the ancient world. There just wasn't something that was always craving your attention back in the days when we were evolving, and now everything's craving your attention. I mean, it could very well be people watching this podcast. As we go through it, they're checking their email, they're checking their Facebook, they're checking their Insta, and maybe they're going to lose some of the very important ideas that we'll communicate as we continue this discussion.
So when we're using our phones, what's the approximate way that we should be? How do we use it effectively? What have you come across or recommendations that people might not know of how they can actually approach using technology in their day to day?
I mean, that's a great question. Here's the way I sort of think about it. I think so. One thing we know is that people wildly overestimate their ability to multitask, and the evidence for that is every accident that happened because someone was texting while driving. And it's a tragic way to learn this lesson, but there's just no doubt that people overestimate their ability to attend to different things. So, and it's very hard to kind of police yourself in the moment. The way to do this is Alexander 10 minutes ago to say, look, not only am I going to be sure that I'm going to be attending to this instead of, but I'm going to put my phone in the next room so I'm not even tempted. So that Alexander in 10 minutes doesn't he have the option. So he can focus all of his attention on this. I think this is a great way to do business is to have your past self discipline your future self. You can, do that in a number of different ways, locking up your phone or, there's little gadgets you can use to reduce your internet access. But the trick is to win the war before the battle's been joined. You have to develop good techniques to police yourself so that you attend to stuff. I think there's another piece too, which is, there's a lot of evidence now that mindfulness, meditation, and training really helps people focus on what they're doing now. I highly recommend that kind of practice. I myself try. I'm not as not as great as everyone, but that's okay. I'm always trying to get better. And getting into the mindset of when I'm doing a thing, I'm going to do that thing, and I'm not going to worry about the other stuff. I think that kind of practice is potentially really, really profound and can make a big difference in your life.
I wonder as we have the complexity or these like jarring thoughts of, oh, I need to do this, I need to double check that. It's like those are forms of tension in a way. Like, so when we sit down and meditate, we try to relax our minds. We easily then become aware of like the emerging thoughts, the kind of reminders, or when you like go to bed at night, the infamous, oh shoot, I got to do that. I just remembered, right? I think sometimes it comes in a benefit where it helps you resolve something. Like you need to go do something and you get up out of bed and, you try to take care of that thing real quick. Because if you fall asleep, you probably won't remember it tomorrow. But then there's the negative side where some of those are like jarring for your attention and it increases stress. It's like feeling like there's like a dark side that inhibits the access to our mental resources.
Totally. And the way I sort of think about it is that, we have these complicated brains and some parts of it are really fancy, like our working memory, our attention, and it's limited. And so at any given moment, you can only be kind of contemplating or attending to one thing at a time. And that's a precious resource that we have. And, it's interesting because, when people talk about this now in the psychological literature, they talk about mind wandering, right? So I'm focusing on this task, but then as you say, oh, I left the stove on, or I should have had a slightly better comeback to that insult or whatever. And I think that makes a lot of sense. From an evolutionary point of view, it's sort of like you have a lot of priorities that are incubating in the back. And yeah, like if all of a sudden you remember the stove was on, you want to go back and turn it off or whatever it would have been. And so I think that can be, functional and adaptive. It's just that in the modern world, the way I always think about it is every time I do X, Y, or Z, I open up a little folder. Oh, I've got to cook dinner. I've got a plan for this trip. I've got whatever. And then a lot of times they stay open. And what evolution has done is sort of said, okay, well, if a folder is open, every now and then I'm just going to sort of like call your attention to it and be like, should you do that now? Is that a thing you should do? And the challenge we have in modern life is we have so many folders. All of us have so many folders open, not just, literally on our, how many times do people have 87 tabs open in a browser or have a directory structure with like a million branching structures? And so there is something valuable that, as you say, if you left the stove on, you should go back and turn it off for sure. But like, if every single one of your folders is like, hey, remember me? And that could be, I wonder how many likes that post got. I wonder how many comments my last essay that I posted on Substack. You know what I mean? So, and then you just gotta, I do think that again, you've got to win those battles beforehand. You've got to develop a discipline to be like, okay, well, I'm going to attend to things when I need to attend to them, prioritize them. And then again, just sort of like when I'm doing a thing and I want to attend to it. And by the way, this has an important effect on social life. I mean, I think, one way in the modern world, and Dale Carnegie said this in his book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, what people really like when you're talking to them? For you to pay attention to the fact that you're talking to them. And how many times in the modern world have you talked to someone like, hey, I got a like on my picture from Disney, So I just attending to a conversation can really help you stand out now. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I love the concept of the folders, and like if you can kind of think about the core self of who we are. We have these duties, our role in society, our job, our career. And then all these like subfolders of small little tasks and broader folders, which might represent our, ambitious goals or, ideal outcome scenarios in other areas of life. Do you perceive the self as really just this combination that we're all just darting from like one focus of our attention to the next? Is there really like a core inherent being self underneath it all? Are we kind of this just the processing power of like what the existing moment is calling for, and like all the back end knowledge or back end folders that might have a link tree to what's needed in that moment?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So the way I sort of think about this, Walt Whitman has that remark that he contains multitudes, and in many ways that echoes what we're finding in cognitive science. So Marvin Minsky talked about a society of mind, where there's lots of different parts of the mind that have different responsibilities, and then Jody Fodor, another cognitive scientist, talked about modularity, the idea that there's all these different systems in your head. And that's the view that I take. So my view is that the brain is not this homogeneous mush like an LLM. Everyone is looking at these new AIs and thinking, oh, maybe we're just running a correlation matrix about what we're going to. That's not the way. I mean, that's the way an intelligence works. That's probably not the way our intelligence works. Ours are more, as you're saying, a bunch of different stuff, sort of this modular approach, and some of them are active at any given moment and some of them are inactive, right? So when you're super hungry, the module that makes you want to eat is in charge, and then when you're not hungry, it doesn't do much, whatever. Same thing for all the other modular systems. So when I think about that, it makes it hard to think that there's some unified self in there. We're more like an amorphous, it's almost like a congress, or I think of it, it's not a perfect metaphor, but the iPhone is kind of like this. You've got a bunch of specialized apps in your phone. The thing about it is that there's only one on the screen at any given time, but you wouldn't say at that time that's like the self. Like if you're in your email, you would say, well, your email is like, or your iPhone is itself at the email. No, that's one of the things it can be. The way that humans are a little different is that we have these memories, right? So we have part of our self means, who are we in the sense of what have we done, who have we done it with, yada, yada, yada. But in terms of the identity, I take the more like a kind of a Buddhist approach to this, which is there's no one unified self running the show in there. There's no little guy who's got his hands on the levers. You know, it's more like we're these creatures that are being pushed around by these different forces in our head. You know what I mean?
And the biological imperatives, the instincts that come from our genes, that come from our ancestors, that kind of activate in moments or have like an overarching influence on our life.
Totally. And you can see this, like, I don't want to minimize human intelligence, and we can plan, we do all this fancy stuff, but like, it's these were pretty simple, right? Like, I think a lot about how the first time someone showed a movie and the train was coming at them, and people like jumped off of their chairs because they didn't understand that the train was a projection, or they understood, but it's still scary. The point is, something comes looming at you, you duck. You see, if you see something delicious or whatever, and then your hunger says get out. So we're like, I like to say, it's not a great quote, but I like to say all psychology is local, and by that I mean we really are sort of so heavily influenced. You put a tiger in front of me, nothing else doesn't matter. What degrees I have, what temperatures I'm going to run. Like I respond to the cues. You put a friendly person in front of me, I'm going to be sociable. And I'm not saying there's no individual differences. I'm saying our human nature gives us this very dynamic, relationship with the world around us.
Have any other discoveries or like insights you've learned recently changed or adapted your way of looking at the world?
A little bit. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think that I think people underestimated, to some extent at least. So people have different appetites, right? People have they want to eat food and they want to be well liked, and they want to have money. So I think of those as like appetites. One of the things that I think people wildly underestimated, I've changed my mind about, is people's appetite for like morally, like riding moral high horses, moral attacks, saying someone's bad, 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 the sort of the wagging the finger. I think one of the things that technology did is it gave more people the opportunity to get, to join with their friends and say, that guy over there, that guy's bad, and they did a bad thing. And you see this in different, I don't want to get too deeply into the politics, but you see this in whatever. I think people just wildly underestimated how much people just love doing that. They just love to say that guy over there is bad. If it's a guy on the other team, he's horrible. And then everyone can sort of gang up. And that has really, I think we need to take account of that as we kind of build societies, because if people love to just morally judge others and go after them, particularly as the communication infrastructure gets better and better, where everybody has a chance to say whatever they want about anybody, it's sort of a dangerous world because the beast needs to be fed, right? So even the early people who did communication studies are like, what leads in a newspaper? Well, either someone got hurt or someone did a bad thing. That's basically what leads. And so we've known this, but now you really can see it in stark relief as everyone has the chance to clamor on and say what a horrible person the person on the other side is. So that's changed my view a little bit. I think we need to find a way around that as a species. Like, how can we tame the moralistic impulse in the same way that we've done a pretty good job of taming some impulses? I mean, in lots of places, by and large, you can walk down the street and among a million strangers and you're pretty safe. Didn't used to be that way. As recently as a few hundred years ago, you walk down in some group, a crowd of people, no one knows you, man. That could be trouble for you, depending on exactly where you live.
Yeah, I mean, it's the tribal conflict. It's the outsiders. It's the get people on your team to take over and exert your power, your influence. Why do you think that? Why other reasons are people in maybe the current political climate like choosing to, I guess, weigh so heavily on the communication of, I guess it's like, hey, you're just completely wrong. It's completely bad. And it doesn't sound like we're really like curious. It's almost like the curiosity, I guess, level is at an all-time mute. And it's just a very, very like loud blame. And I guess part of the body is there, like, it's like aspects are firing off, like adrenaline and tribalism, and the things can all kind of swing so heavy and get propagated so fast because of technology.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that's a really important piece of it. Like, I feel like, so my early work, when I was in graduate school doing research in psychology, one of the first topics I wanted to sort of try to think about was what we called coalitional psychology. We could think of as like tribalism, people in groups, or whatever you want to say. And one of the things that really impressed me was the crazy things that people would say and believe in order to signal to everybody else in their group, hey, I'm one of you. And, in some sense, that makes a lot of sense. You look at human history, and one of the biggest predictors of what your destiny was, were you part of the group that was on the ascendant and was dominant, or were you on the other, were you not? And you really wanted to be part of the group that was on the ascendant, because if you didn't, people would take your stuff and your health, they could hurt you and so on. And so when you put it in that context, you're like, wait a minute, my very life depended on other people thinking that I was in their group or in their tribe. Then it starts to make sense. Then you ask yourself, what wouldn't people say? And, I used to think a lot about religion and supernatural beliefs. And, people, I think that a lot of those supernatural beliefs emerged because it was a way for me to say, oh, you think that, I mean this with full respect. I'm just taking this as an example. It's like, oh, and here we are. By the way, we're recording this not too far from Ash Wednesday. I'm not making any criticism of any religion. I'm saying, you're a guy. You think that there was a guy and he died and then he came back to life 3 days later. I think that too. You and I are the same in that way. And that's a very powerful thing, right? Like, the only way we could come to that supernatural belief is if it had the same origin, right? Because we're group members. It's not like you're independently going to come up with that idea. The place where I think you really worry about this is, I was a scientist for many, many years, and my sense is that you would have thought that science was the one place where people were going to choose to say the thing they thought that was true, as opposed to the thing that would make them good team members. And, my former mentor, John Tooby, who unfortunately passed away last year, he made this point that, man, scientists are tribal too. If you have a choice between publishing, here's what I think is true, or publishing, here's what I think would make me a good group member, to say, people are going to do the second thing most of the time because they want to preserve their careers, they want to have friends, and we're tribal animals, right? So we want to be part of the tribe. How do you do that? Say this thing that everyone else thinks. So that really scares me, right? And you can see this in other contexts as well, right? I like these kinds of interviews. People go, again, not to get too political, but people go to protests and they say, "Oh, you're protesting X." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm protesting X." And you say, "Well, what do you know about X? Do you know this very basic fact?" And they're like, "I don't, I don't really." Yeah. You're like, wait a second. So they're not there because they have a belief about whatever it is that they're whatever. They're there because their friends are there, wearing the colors and bearing the sign. You know what I mean? So that's the thing that I find. I find that. I mean, honestly, scary. The scariest things are humans is when we get together in groups because, man, people in groups do horrible things.
Well, our identity, to be able to uh, axe yourself from the group because a new belief, or you're willing to question what you believed, and God forbid, you learn new information or you ask really thought-provoking questions, and you get around a topic and you hear a new viewpoint, or you do end up evolving your stance. It's almost like then we're very committed to our identity. And our identity is often aligned with multiple other people, like in a company, for example. You don't want to be too politically pushy and create enemies or say things in a way or be too combative, right? There's a political way to navigate and to find allegiances. And I think ultimately we want to ensure the selfhood, the self-prospering of our identity. And it is fascinating when you go out to like a big group thing where it is, I don't know if it's because of the time or the effort to like really say, hey, let's like put the questions or the debates, the topics for debate out on the table. And let's really try to dig into each one. It also takes effort. It takes a length of time. It takes hearing opposite sides, steel manning an argument, seeing the other person's perspective and maybe trying to support it. And so maybe in the fast-paced world, to dominate, everything is shortened, right? And we adopt an identity, or we continue our identity because it saves us time, and we don't want to spend more time than necessary and having to unravel our identity because we find one major issue that we disagree with in our group.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and it's sort of interesting to me the extent to which people are willing to sort of persist in a belief, even when it's just so obvious to everyone else, or maybe people not in the group, that that belief is false. As you say, it's got this. I think identity is one way to think about it. Membership in the group is one way to think about it, and also it's just easy, right? So if I just keep persisting, as you were talking, one of the things I think about was we had this discussion once about, when people have an argument, it never ends with someone being right and the other person saying, "Oh, you know what? I am so glad that you updated my belief about this thing that I was wrong about. Like, I want to thank you because I had a false belief and now I've got a true one." Like no one ever says that because we have the metaphor of an argument is a fight. It's like, oh, you don't say, you say I lost the fight. You don't say I learned something in the discussion, right? This is a weird part of human nature, is that we're not just hungry for knowledge, we're hungry to maintain our identity in the face of these perceived attacks. And I say that partly because, again, having been among scientists for so long, when I first started, I thought, okay, I'm going to go into a scientific community and everyone's going to like put their data in front of them, and everyone around the table is going to look at it objectively and say, oh, okay, well, those data support such and such a belief or hypothesis or theory or whatever. And everyone would kind of wind up agreeing because they're all looking at the same data. And then when you get to it, you're like, oh man, that's not it at all. Like, that is the most naive view ever. It's like, no, but my theory is right and your theory is wrong, and I want to continue to believe my theory is right. So even if scientists can't do it, what hope do we have for as you were saying, someone who's in the in a different.
This makes me think about, and I'd like to let's double click into how profound of a statement, how we could be better is to challenge the notion in discussions to end with the thought, wow, thank you for updating my beliefs. And to be more open to defining why I thought a certain way. This makes me think of a quote. I think I just saw Ray Dalio, who wrote something like how he prepares for an argument, or reflecting. It's I spend more time not on why I'm right or saying I'm right, and more time on knowing why, like the things supporting why I'm right. So rather than just coming from the tribalism, hey, I'm maintaining my status. This is how I've always thought. This is my group allegiance. This is how it is. I'm right. Well, these are the reasons I'm right. And then let's address that, which takes time, though. That takes sitting at a table and discourse and effort to blend understanding with somebody else's viewpoint and to see the world from another angle.
Yeah, totally. And I think you've got it right there, which is, yeah, it takes effort. I mean, it's very easy to come into a discussion and sort of just commit to the view you started with. It doesn't really require much in the way of thought. I mean, at the end of the day, many humans most of the time are pretty lazy, and it takes a little time and some effort to entertain other ideas. And so the thing that's frustrating is that it's I don't know, there've got to be communities where people do learn from one another. I mean, I think about all the successful enterprises, businesses, and so on, and scholarly pursuits, scientific pursuits. Those must have been communities where they had a good kind of culture, if you will, of getting rid of the bad ideas, right? Because at the end of the day, if your widget doesn't work, no one's going to buy your widget. And so there must be ways to organize ourselves where people are incentivized or motivated to do as you're saying. Like, well, let's figure out what does the evidence say? What do the facts say? And again, not to pursue this, not to perseverate on this, but that's what science was supposed to be all about. And to some extent, business does that a little bit because again, if your thing doesn't work, then you're not going to be able to sell it. But I think in normal everyday conversations and in many different political contexts, I don't see that dynamic. There's not the same, hey, let's get to the truth. It's more, let's get my team on top of your team.
And that's very well said. Let's get to the truth. It's almost like maybe I can imagine that it's an attack on identity for somebody to even just open up their cards to say, hey, this is why I think I'm right to the best of my knowledge, but I'm open to updating my belief on this. Honestly, I think I'm going to steal that. That's a good one of just having a way to diffuse the discourse that has to go down if you're talking about, let's say, a charged topic like politics, especially at a family table or at a group friends table. But if there's other contexts, as maybe within like your company culture, right? You want to make sure you're diffusing the threat that you're really trying to challenge. Is that maybe an aspect? Is there any other ways that you found that really help communicate in a sincere way, that you're curious about the other person's position or how they've gotten to this, so that you can create hopefully an initiative that let's get to the truth of the matter?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm glad you mentioned the family because it lets me talk about my dad a little bit, singular man. And one of the things that he introduced me to when I was quite young, you know, this will shock your viewers, but I was a pretty nerdy kid in middle school and high school. I know, hard to believe, but it's true. And so I was in debate club, and my dad gave me some guidance about that. And one of the things he said is, when I was training for debate club, I would spend some time with a friend of mine, and we would pick a topic, and then we would draw straws or flip a coin for which side we would take. And so you wouldn't wind up just always defending the view that you held. You would have to defend the other one. And I got to say, it's a great technique because it really does force you, as you said, to steelman the argument, to build the best possible case for it. And I thought, and I have tried that from time to time. I'll tell you this: in the modern world, very few people are interested in doing that, which I think someone should study this because, like, again, if you do want to just get to the truth, not a bad way to do it is to say, okay, well, take the other side. What is your best effort to make a case for the other side, and that forces you to look at new evidence and maybe look at old evidence in new ways and so on. So I would love to see more of that. I'll tell you one other piece of this. My former I'm pointing this way because Penn's that way. My former colleague at Penn, Phil Tetlock, and some others have developed a technique which in which they get two or more people to collaborate on a scientific project, and they agree beforehand about what the method is going to be, and so but they've got to be two people who disagree about some topic. And so they say, okay, well, how would you arbitrate it? Let's not run the study yet, but agree on, well, if it comes out this way, that looks good for me and it looks bad for you, whatever. This kind of collaboration of rivals, if you will. And I feel like if people did that in more context, that might be a really good way. Like, what would persuade you? Like, what would persuade you of, the thing that you don't believe? And if there's nothing that won't persuade you, if there's nothing that won't persuade you, then you don't have a belief, you have faith, right? You have some kind of, religious commitment, and that's fine. Like people are entitled to certain, commitments, religious commitments, or some things which I'm not open to persuasion on. But I hope most things I am. And so I feel like that kind of a technique might be. I find that very exciting in terms of a way to sort of get people to maybe be a bit more open and broad minded than they otherwise would be.
So when you engage with your colleagues, is that something that you consider, like trying to understand their motives or what drives them, it sounds like, and then how could you persuade them to adopt a new approach? Is this new approach benefiting them? And do you focus purely on like that as your discussion to help express the viewpoint that maybe you had originally, but you're doing so in a context of how it helps them or how it could adjust their worldview or enhance their life in some way?
That is interesting. I mean, I never want to kind of seem cynical, or I dislike negativity, but my sense is that many people's minds, whether it's in the scientific world, the political world, and so on, they're just not really that malleable. That though you got to sort of like get people in their formative years, right? So that's when all of these beliefs sort of crystallize, and so and then after that, for better or worse, they ossify. Now, in some cases, that's not true. I mean, some people have certainly changed their minds. I mean, I've changed my mind on some things. It does happen. Usually, it requires either a lot of evidence or some massive piece of evidence. Something that is just too big to ignore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but other than that, the fact of the matter is that again, it goes back to our discussion about groups. It's just not helpful for most people to change their mind about stuff. I mean, especially about stuff that doesn't affect their bottom line. That's just their identity or their group membership or what have you. I don't know. I mean, I would almost throw the question back at you. I mean, you're sort of in this interesting position of having these interesting conversations with people, and I myself don't experience people changing their mind a lot. But that could just be because I live in a narrow bubble. I don't really know.
What comes to mind for me is it's when when working with someone or in discourse, so let's say at your job, it's almost better to have people come up with the idea themselves and not try to tell someone like, hey, like if you're trying to persuade someone or in negotiations, for example, you don't want to just directly kind of, I guess, point someone to your stance or where you're trying to help them land. You more kind of want to ask these thought-provoking questions of like, oh, like, well, maybe like, what are your values? Well, how much does that matter to you? Do you consider this important? And then I guess it's almost like the slow way to kind of like guide a horse to drink, from I'm not sure that I'm trying to remember the metaphor. But you kind of guide somebody gently. And I think it's like a rule of thumb. I'm curious if that's worked well in different situations, or how to do it, or, if that's the status of like a great leader, someone that never forces kind of forward and is someone that's really tactful and enabling people to kind of like slowly come up to the idea and consider maybe it's an idea themselves that they came up with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to do some name dropping. So I worked with Vernon Smith, who would go on after I worked with him. He would go on to win the Nobel Prize. And so I paid very careful attention to him when I had a chance to sort of sit with him. And I was at dinner one night. So this was after he won the prize. And someone said to him, and I'm so glad I was there for this. Someone said to him, "So, it's won the, what is the main lesson that you have learned? Like, what did you learn?" Vernon, great guy. He's got this kind of southern accent. I won't try to imitate it, but it's a little. So he says, "Well, people respond to incentives." And he just loved that. So when I was thinking about what you were talking about, like leading a horse to water, making him drink, or whatever, is, how can I make it worthwhile? Like, how can I incentivize that person to either come to my point of view or to feel like it would be good for them to at least come to the correct point of view? And that, I think, as you're saying, is sort of, that's a good way to go, is to think about, well, to continue with the horse metaphor, you sort of want to put a carrot in front of them or the water in front of them that says, I want to make your life, I want you to think that your life is going to be better if you have the true belief as opposed to the one that you might or might not have right now. And how do we do that? I think that's hard. As you're saying, one way is to give them credit for the idea when they get there, right? So everyone likes to be status, the high status guy. And so if you sort of plant the seeds, if you sort of incept some idea that turns out to be a good one, that they themselves get credit for and they get behind, that's a great idea. I love that. And I think in our best moments as teachers, mentors, whatever you want to say, that's definitely a technique that can be so powerful. Is to yeah, and that's, by the way, and I think another way, a lot of this stuff goes back to the ancients. The Socratic method. There's something there, right? So you ask people the right questions and you let them come to the conclusion. So you're not telling them, you're not telling them, well, let me just ask you, like, well, what would that policy do if people did blah blah blah, whatever. And then as they answer their questions, I think that I don't like the metaphor of ownership, but they sort of take ownership over it. They're like, oh, I sort of got there. Like he just asked, he's just asking questions, but I answered them and I built this kind of response. I think those sorts of techniques can be very powerful.
Yeah, well said. If we were to zoom out a little bit to modern society and the macro world of where we're heading, do you have any ideas or things that are changing evolutionary from an evolutionary psychology or morality perspective, the trends, anything there that we're being led to, or if you can comment on like what's happening in the world from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean it's so hard to make these predictions, but I mean, like so many people, I just can't imagine that the AI and the combination of AI plus robotics. I mean, it just seems to me this is going to produce overwhelming change. I mean, I keep seeing, discussions about the sorts of jobs that are this close. Some of it's already gone, right? About being replaced, and that's going to bring up this question that I think the question, and I could definitely be wrong about this. I think the question is: suppose we're in a world in which 98% of the stuff that gets done today, either thinking about things or making nice pictures or moving stuff from one place to another. I mean, that's basically what happens, right? Those are the three things that humanity does. We move stuff around, we think about ideas, and we create art. That's coarse, but kind of. Like, looks like it's going to be taken care of for us, pretty soon. And then the question is, what happens if we can create a world of plenty, but no one has to do anything? Now, you could, if you're an optimist, you would say, well, that sounds like nirvana. Wait, we don't have to do anything and we can have all this stuff. We can have movies and we can have food and we can have rockets. That sounds, robots making other robots. But like, there's people who've written dystopian novels about that, like Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, right? They thought about that and they were like, well, I don't know. I mean, it might not be as great as it's current. Maybe it will be, but I think we should at least start thinking about what would a world look like in which we don't have to have people work a lot and still we can feed ourselves and have host parties and have fireworks and drone shows or whatever. Because I don't know, man. Like I do fear idle hands a little bit, and I do fear humans with too much time on their hands. At the end of the day, I think the thing that people miss, and this is, my background in economics, is there's always going to be scarcity because not everybody can have the house at the very edge of the beach, right, or right on the beach. So we're going to have. There's always going to be some people who have something better than someone else. It's never going to be Star Trek, right, where everyone just, oh, you want this thing, yeah, whatever, Earl Grey, hot, whatever. So it could be that people don't really have to do much. And that's sort of the question that I have. What does human nature look like when you're not required to be valuable to other people because you don't have to produce stuff because there's enough stuff? I don't know. I could be completely wrong about that.
I think this comes to me, the like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the ultimate goal for a human is to be able to check the survival box, be able to check the security and the wealth, be able to check these drives, like perhaps drive for power, for control, for security, to be able to get to the level of freedom. And the freedom state is your self actualization, your expression of art, your influence on the broader community. So I envision if we have everything where humanoid robots or dimension appropriate robots are outfitted for factories, for deliveries, for moving atoms, and everything's getting generated, and somehow the grocery store is fully stocked and prices are all near free, that then we'll ultimately have just more free time to, I think, connect with our higher aspirations, which could be a spiritual calling, could be a community calling, or ultimately could be an artistic calling. I think even personally, this form of art, podcasting, and connecting with people, it feels like it's just at the heart and it's at the center of being human. It's almost like right now with the lights, we've got a campfire, right? And we're sitting around and telling stories and relating with one another and exploring the dimensions that we both have on the world and the data and the perspectives. And there's so much that goes into that. So I imagine, like you said, with scarcity and properties, there's also scarcity and quality, right? Quality foods, quality art, quality movies, quality experiences, right? You can go just outside and take a walk, go to the beach, or you can get on a plane and go to a great music festival or climb a mountain somewhere and go down the river in Peru or the Amazon. So I think there's going to be a desire or some type of way that we do have a system of currency or some type of way that our time or access to scarcity or quality is balanced with what I've heard from Mark Andreessen, and I believe is happening, is the kind of overall ideal scenario of lowering prices on everything, where everything just should ideally become more cheaper or more available at a higher quality with our capitalistic society. At least that's a hope that I have that we do get to.
I agree with Andreessen's analysis here. So I agree that if you take seriously the idea that we're going to have these AIs and robots and so on, then they should be able to produce stuff and the cost of labor will decline markedly. And so that should reduce prices. It's something that I haven't seen a lot of other people talking about, but I agree with that. The part that I want to like kind of push you on a little bit, don't get me wrong, I love the model you're laying out where you do get to the top of the hierarchy of needs and you self-actualize and you ask, what does that look like? I have some slight concerns. One of them is, you know, I the last bit was supposed to be, this civilization of artists. And my only concern there is like, I'm looking at what these AIs are doing, and I got to tell you, man, whether it's the poetry or the stills or the movies or the audio, the music, I'm like, they're already pretty good at it. And so I for the first time, I have some concern about, this notion of human creativity. I would love to be one of those guys who says, look, there's something about the human spark that no machine could ever imitate. And I don't know, man. Like, I think I still might believe that. I mean, I'm open to persuasion, but like, I don't know. I'm pretty impressed with what these guys are up to. So I'm just thinking about, I like the other piece, right? So the other piece you're saying is, look, I have this thing. I can do a podcast. I can serve other people with information. I can serve other people in interesting ways that maybe can't be duplicated by the built world, by the AIs, by the robots, by the movies. I hope that's true, and I do think there's still something to do with this kind of interaction. Two humans talking to each other. I don't know. The other piece is that we already have AI podcasts, and the thing about these guys is that they have unlimited time. There's one of you, but once you have a thing that can make podcasts, if it can make one, it can make an arbitrarily large number, and then I'm not saying this keeps me up at night yet. I'm saying, you see what I mean? Like, I'm not sure quite exactly what the human element is, what's left, like what's in the corner there.
Do you imagine in your dystopian flavors of what you've read, do we end up merging with AI? Do we become like cybernetic and get upgrades? Do you see that there's an integration there? Or do you imagine the future where AI is just this, we just have very fast software and robots, a world of robots, where humans are kind of separate and not interfaced, integrated?
People have told me that I tend to be a little overly optimistic about technology. Maybe that's true. I mean, I did lose a bet. So I made a wager with someone about 7 years ago that by about 2 years ago, there would be the first commercial flight that didn't have a person on board as a pilot. I thought they would be controlled on the ground, kind of like a drone. Um, that didn't happen, and I guess that's still years away. So I tend to be overly optimistic. Having said that, I would be shocked. I mean, my view of the future is very much one of these. I mean, I read too much science fiction. I watch too many science fiction movies, but like that people are going to come. They're going to have mods where people can add different elements, whether they're computers or cameras or sensors or information. I mean, I'm actually a little bit surprised I can't, even now just look at my hand and find out what time it is or whatever it is you want to add in there. So I think it's going to be the first one. I think that, and part of it is because there's this health aspect to it, right? So people, I also am super optimistic about longevity. I wouldn't be that surprised, although we'll never find out, if the first person who's basically immortal has already been born. If by the time that person is 30 years old, 30 whatever, we're pretty good at technology that can lengthen lives, and then they just got to live long enough so they get the next advance, right? So there's like a little spool. So I am pretty bullish on the path of technology, and yeah, people want to be healthy. So what's that going to mean? It's going to mean putting in little gizmos in them. I myself have a little gizmo in my left knee. My mom has a gizmo in her heart. Lots of people have gizmos here and there. And I feel like that change is more quantitative than qualitative. I mean, if you can make people as good as they were, why not make them a little better than they were? I mean, that's the way it's going to start, I would think, right? That would be my guess.
So you're a big supporter of the Don't Die movement? Is that Brian Johnson?
Yeah, I would not say I'm a supporter. I think it is inevitable that people will try to not die. And I think in virtue of how much people care about not dying, the resources that will eventually be pumped into it, I just, maybe it won't happen. There could be constraints we don't understand. Like, again, you got to be human about these things. But like, I don't know, I'm pretty impressed with the fact that, my first love is in biology. And there's plenty of species. So, everything gets older, right? You can count how old, but not everything senesces. That is, not everything gets worse and worse as they get older. There's species of trees and species of like fish that the only reason those things die is that, they get attacked or, they make one wrong move or there's a fire or something like that. But they don't have a natural lifespan. And so my view is, well, if a fish can more or less carry on, because people say, well, what about entropy? And my view is, well, hold on. Like, entropy assumes you're not adding energy to the system. Like, we have energy added every day. We have sunlight, we have other sources of energy. So like that argument, I don't find very persuasive. Now, again, there could be something biological which we don't understand. I mean, people have telomeres and yada yada yada. But it's just, I go back to Vernon, and he's like, the incentive to live for a very long time, that's a big incentive. The guy who invents the thing that gives you, 2x or whatever it is, that is going to be rich beyond the dreams of avarice. So I'm a believer in tech and I'm a believer in incentives. So we put those things together. I'm like, something's going to happen there.
Well, I think our goals are going to have to become more audacious. So if we can live and really work, right? So the middle part of your life, 40, 50, 60 years old, and then you're ready for your retirement, 70, 80, 90. Well, you only really have like from 20 to maybe 50, 60, right? For 30, 40 years to really crank out your ambitious goals. But if we had a timeline that we live centuries. How crazy would that be? You'd really have to level up your goals.
Yeah. Totally. And imagine the amount of time you'd have to develop different kinds of expertise. I mean, you could, and the other thing, of course, is that one of the things that we're starting to see with AI, although not as much as maybe you'd think, is the cross pollination. So we've never had a human who, I mean, you know, we have some people who read so much that sometimes it seems like they do, but like we never really had a human who was a master of physics, but also chemistry and biology, but also humanities and history, whatever. Like you, there's not enough time to master all that stuff. But yeah, as you're saying, if you're measuring your lifespan in centuries, not decades, then yeah, maybe you take the first 20 years of your life to learn chemistry or whatever it is. And who knows what the cross pollination would do, right? Like if you have all these different sets of ideas, and you can apply one domain to the other, that could be very exciting in terms of creativity, right? You could draw inspiration from all of these, different whatever. And by the way, I was giggling earlier because the economist Tyler Cohen, he strikes me as one of these guys who maybe he's at least a close to expert in basically any discipline you could mention. So there's people who are getting there who have that, on the agenda, but you know, he's limited by the mortal coil.
And the constraints of just being one person. I mean, yes, you can leverage many other people, resources, technology to be able to accomplish things. I think what's exciting is imagining the future, like what Elon Musk with the whole Starship and becoming multi-planetary. So if humans can leverage like the Matrix chip and instantly download and become a master in multiple fields, or have access to information that higher IQ or people of like incredible intelligence just seem to be able to like memorize, reading a book and instantly having recollection and being able to synthesize things at very high levels. It'd be really profound. And I think just overall a great benefit. I think we all would love to have super mental powers. And then what does that do if we can expand our presence into the solar system and go beyond? I mean, really, then it's an infinity game. It's just how far can we go?
Yeah, it's potentially a very exciting future, and I think we're starting to see the first whiffs of that. I mean, I think a little bit about this in my own life. I mean, there's just no doubt that the availability of these AIs have made me more productive. And so I guess I'll plug. I'm in the middle of writing a book called All the Feels, and I want to try to describe and talk about the evolved function of every single human sensation. And I'm not just plugging the book, I'm using this as a way to talk about, I had to learn about how does the hunger system work? How does the thirst system work? How does the fear, whatever, like some stuff that I didn't really know about. How does the need to breathe work? And what I was finding is that one way in which the AIs were making me more productive, which is a little counterintuitive, it wasn't just I didn't ask them to write a draft. What I did was I wrote what I thought was true based on the whatever I could get from scholarly literature. But the key piece was then I said, okay, tell me have I gotten any facts wrong? Like check this to make sure my understanding is correct. Now again, they're not perfect. They themselves can be wrong. So you've got to double check the double checking. But that is powerful. It's like having an expert in the field who could say, okay, you've made this rookie mistake, or okay, you haven't made that rookie mistake. Because like 90% of being great in, at least in scholarship and so many other domains too, is just not making the rookie mistakes, not making the very basic errors that everyone makes because they're not experts in the field. And man, and then you can then use your time for other to do the next thing. And so what one of the things they're doing is they're a force multiplier in our own productivity in virtue of the fact that they give us very quick feedback on our own productions so that we can improve them. And that strikes me. I mean, again, like going back to rockets, like, I don't know exactly how the future will look in terms of will you be able to give your designs for some gizmo and put it into an AI and say, is this going to blow up? Or, where can I increase efficiency? I don't know. I mean, maybe. And then if that's the case, then what is the development cycle going to look like? Is that going to reduce the development cycle? I mean, we know for sure already that the development cycle in various places that need coders has declined in terms of time because a lot of the code is being written by non-people and they can work really fast. So does that get us to the stars? Probably not soon, but maybe. I mean, I don't know. I'm rewatching The Expanse, which is a great science fiction series, and that provides a relatively nice vision of what it will first look like, right? So first the solar system, and then the stars, something like that.
Can I expand on the book you're writing? When you mentioned how does every sensation work, can you highlight? So you're studying the entire body system, the emotional systems, the mental systems. Like, can you go into some of that? What have you learned most, or
Yeah,
that excited you, and that you'd love to share?
yeah. I mean, I'll talk about this forever. So yeah, so the idea is to take every experience that people have. So it goes from pain to the feeling of hunger to the I've got to pee to love to fear to jealousy to anticipation to the sense of being distracted, which you're talking about. And each one of those things, I argue, has some job to do, has some evolved function. That our ancestors who had this experience, it measured something either in the world or in the body, like how much food is in my stomach, or is there a tiger in front of me? And then it motivated something. Okay, well, I should eat, or I should run away, or the jealousy system. It seems to me that that person is spending a weird amount of time with my romantic partner. That makes me feel angry, and that motivates me to intervene and either make myself a more attractive mate or to maybe, engage in some kind of aggressive behavior. So it's this idea of measuring something in the world and then motivating an adaptive response. And the reason I like this is just because, first of all, it's a, I it's sort of shocking to me that no one has done it yet. That just it's sort of like, no, we have all these interesting feelings, and let's just set them all down in one place and figure out what their job is. And again, the way that I sort of think about that is, and so what have I to learn? Yeah, so I was trained as a psychologist, so I know a lot about things like friendship and mating and morality, but I didn't know anything about bodily function. So I had to learn all about the way taste buds work. I had to learn about, like, it's actually crazy. The hunger system is way more complicated than I think people think. It's not just how full is your stomach. It has to do, obviously, there's a whole symphony of hormones that get secreted. Your body is keeping track of how long it's been since your last meal. It's keeping track of how much sugar is in your blood right now. It's keeping track of like a million different things, and then it puts it all together, and it's like now you're a little hungry, and then now you're hungrier,
What about
and it motivates whatever. So
the energy of like dieting and having the desirable physique for females and males in society? How does that hunger system and the relaxed system of having being like in the optimal state? I think like everyone looks at someone who's like in great shape and is like, wow, like there's a status, right? There's the identity. I'm that person that's in great shape. There's the feedback loop of people, but then you also have the internal, like what's that like for that person? The amount of food they're eating, they're not eating out and splurging and having ice cream in high density because they're maintaining such a physique. They're maintaining a presence. What could you say on that?
yeah, that's a great question. So I'll say two things about that. The first one is it goes back to our prior discussion about these modules in your head. So one module is telling you eat, 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 and that's like the whatever, and the other module is telling you, well, that doesn't accomplish my goal of looking really great. Like I'm the mating module, and I kind of want to look good, and the hunger module is like, well, but I'm hungry, and so you get, and so that's the second point was that I think, I know this is going to sound a little bit grandiose, but I think that's what consciousness is for. So each of these modules is sort of screaming whatever it is they want right now, but the organism, the person, can only do one thing at a time, or maybe two, but whatever. And so it has to weigh the strength of these different arguments that are being made by the modules. And so it's just a question of, how strong does the hunger thing make you, how much does that make you want to eat compared to the module that's saying, no, you want to look good. And so the consciousness is sort of where it all gets decided. Like, I'm not saying there's one person in there, but I'm saying, the thing about the fact that people can only do one thing at once, but they have different goals, is you have to have some common currency to say, okay, this goal is more important than that. How do you evaluate whether eating this raspberry is more important than, monitoring what the lion behind me is doing? You have to, maybe right now I'm really hungry, so I'm going to do this, and then the line gets a little closer. I'm like, okay, well, now I'm going to do that. So you have to have some way to kind of balance these up, and I think that's what, and not just me, other people think this too, that consciousness is sort of where it all gets glommed together. Where do we make, you got to make these decisions. And so I think that's the answer to your question about these competing drives, is that, I mean, and by the way, the short answer is no one knows. Like, it's really complicated. Somehow every day people have all these competing preferences and drives: be thin, but eat, sugary and fatty foods. And somehow they take a decision, but no one exactly knows how that works. Brains are complicated, but that's sort of the way to think about it: is competing systems. And then the hunger system gets an advantage if something really aromatic is in the area. And then it can be, whatever.
So we have like a value system, and if we want to change our situation, it's we're not valuing enough one of the priorities. So either you're slacking in the value department, which is giving you more comfort and leisure, and you're adopting the lavish dinners and the double snack bags, and you're like, yeah, let's just add it in the cart. Well, we're good. Life is great. State of abundance. Versus the scarcity mindset. Maybe you don't have enough resources to be able to afford things, or you're not in a relationship. And so it's fascinating then how like we do have this interstate that's trying to balance all these initiatives, or perform our self in alignment with the values and what we're trying to accomplish. Another thing that you mentioned, it kind of relates to something I heard about the internal family system by Robert Schwartz. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, no, I haven't, I admit.
So it's something about these like competing aspects of ourselves. It's kind of like a psychoanalysis approach that he formulated, and it's curious because we do have all these like competing aspects on our system, that ultimately there's this core self, this capital S self that's within us. That's the core that has judgments and is being taxed by different areas. And I think this system also talks about like we have judgment protectors within us, or like different aspects that come online. But I'm curious how much those are like entities or aspects of our personality that are a part of us, or are they just sensations? Are they like a part of the emotional fabric of, we can feel sad, we can feel angry, we can feel enthusiastic, we can feel confused, we can feel curious? That there's like this whole dynamic palette of emotions that almost feels universal, that we all can relate with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, it seems kind of dumb, but I sort of think about this not so unlike that series of Disney films where they have different characters inside whatever the main character's head, joy and anger and so on. And, sometimes one of them is at the controls and sometimes the other one's at the controls, and there's no real one in charge, there's no captain. And so those things are really in there. Don't get me wrong, personality matters too. Like, for some people, the joy character really is out there because they're ebullient, and for some people, the fear character runs the show because they are constantly, as you're saying, sort of always anxious, chronically afraid, or what have you. But they're all in there. I think it's actually a good metaphor for the way the mind works, is to think about us all having these emotional systems on board. And then sometimes they are at the control panel, depending on stuff that's happening in your head, but also stuff that's happening out in the world, that they, when you're in a joyful situation or at a birthday party, then the joyful character is sort of running the show, and you're more extroverted and you kind of move around more and whatever. And then at other times, there's danger, and so you don't move around as much. Now the fear guy is running the show. And I think we all have, that's a way of saying we all have these emotions. We all have the potential for all these different kinds of behaviors. And it just depends on the context. And that takes me back to another point you made, which is, you always want to sort of, you can never win the game in the moment. So if I have this very weird thing where I cannot resist like cereal in the morning. If there's a cereal box in the pantry, I just weirdly crave it. And so when I'm in the grocery store, and especially if I'm not that hungry, I can avoid purchasing cereal. Not a problem. I can look at the cornflakes on the shelf and have all right, you're fine. But man, if my partner, if she brings some cereal into the house, which she shouldn't, and if she's watching this, I'm watching you. I can't avoid it. So in that context, you can think of it as like my little hunger guy. He sees the thing on the shelf, and he's like, okay, all you other people, you can't do anything right now. I'm going to run the show. I'm going to grab this thing, I'm going to grab the milk, and then we're just going to, you know what I mean? So, and that's why you've got to mind your context, right? This is why alcoholics can't just go to a bar and white knuckle it. They've got to not go to the bar because we're good at avoiding the context. We have four brains that allow us to plan, but we have those little characters in our heads, like in Inside Out or whatever it is, and they will run amok if they're put into the right context. That's my
How much of this is from evolutionary psychology? How much is this like in our genes? Is there a perspective there that relates with how our brain can get hijacked and we're negatively impacted? And also, how do we positively impact our brain? How do we hack our neural pathways in a way that gives us full access to ourself so that we can succeed?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way I think about evolutionary psychology is that it sort of, came about in the 80s as sort of the what was called the cognitive revolution in psychology was sort of had matured, and what evolutionary psychology brought to the table was this idea of modularity. It said people come equipped with these specialized systems that are designed to solve the problems that our ancestors would have faced. And so the first offering that evolutionary psychology has is says, okay, if you want to think about what the design of the human mind is likely to be, think about what would have been a good design for someone living in a world with 200 other people where there's animals that can eat them and no grocery stores, but a campfire or two and whatever. So it helps you think, and what would those preferences look like, And so we tend to have preferences for the things that would have been scarce, right? So like, oxygen is really important to breathing. And Don Simon's at Santa Barbara, he unfortunately passed away, but he made this point where it's like, oxygen doesn't feel great to breathe because you weren't competing with everyone to breathe. Like it was always for free, right? So, but the things that were scarce, like with really good cuts of meat and the best partners for mates and so on, those would have been really difficult to obtain, if you will. And so those things feel really rewarding. Or leadership roles, like only one guy is at any point has the conch, and so if you hold the conch, that's really rewarding. So evolutionary psychology tells you where to look for what these preferences I think are going to look like. Now, in terms of your other question, I mean, yeah, how do you live? How do you use that to live a good life? I'll tell you, the short answer is I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. But I'll say a couple things. So one thing that has helped me. So I live in Philadelphia. Every now and then you're walking down the street in Philadelphia and someone randomly just drops their shoulder and shoves you to the side for no obviously good reason. This is the joy of an urban lifestyle, particularly in an angry city like Philly. Talking about love city, go birds, big fan. On the other hand, the human anger system evolved in a world in which you pretty much always were going to see the person who just picked on you tomorrow. Like they were always going to be around. And what that meant is if you don't do anything, if you don't take your revenge, if you don't get angry, then they're going to do it again tomorrow. And eventually they're going to take your stuff. And eventually they're going to do whatever. The evolutionary psychology, for me, it says, wait a second. I am angry at that person, but that's my evolved anger system saying I need to defend my honor in a world in which every interaction is repeated so that they know that when they see me, but this, I'm never going to see that person again. For sure, I'm never going to see that person again. So there's no point in letting my emotional system get the better of me. So I'm like, okay, well, that happened. It's not going to make my world any better to run after them and tell them they're a horrible person for an unprovoked attack. That is not helpful. So I think understanding where these impulses and emotions come from, you can step back for a second and say, wait a second, this is evolution telling me to take revenge to protect my future, but evolution's got it wrong because it didn't know about cities. It didn't know about the impersonal world we live in. So you know what? Let's just keep going. Let's just go to the coffee shop, and whatever. So I think those are the things that I think are helpful. There's other stuff too, like maybe not a great example. I'm off the market, but certainly, so in ancestral environments, if you approach a potential partner and you completely blow it, that might have been one of like 10 people who you could potentially have as a potential mate, right? Because there's just not that many folks around. So I think much of the fear that people have in social contexts is again driven by the fact that evolution is saying this is a high stakes interaction. You do not want to blow this. In fact, if you can avoid it right now, you probably should. And so, that can be helpful for, taking the edge off. So again, I don't want to get quite into that whole literature, but like a lot of what people were saying, talking to how to approach strangers, if obviously in a benevolent way, is that fear is not a rational fear. That fear is evolution saying, this is one of the small number of people in your social world, so don't mess it up. Whereas you're like, if it does go badly, okay, never see them again. So it's things like that which I think can help you think a little bit. One last thing is if we're these incredibly status conscious creatures, and so a lot of people want to go around the world, displaying their high status, whether that's through a fancy watch or a car or some information they know. Again, I think it helps to think, well, oh, this is evolution. I would do just fine with a watch that tells me what time it is. I don't need one that will, that's it. So I think those are a few cases where I think, the evolutionary view can kind of corral you in a little bit.
Yeah, the desire for status and approval, right? We're we're tribal beings. We want to seek uh, that satisfaction of knowing that we're on the same team, that we have a large uh, following, or people are engaged, like we're in good spirits, so that if anything were to go down, that you'd be prepared. So speaking of the energy that comes up when you're in like a social gathering, or when you're feeling awkward or fearful about starting a conversation, so that's deeply rooted. Is there like real evidence that the fear that comes up from like talking to like a potential romantic partner is from the evolutionary psychology perspective of, oh my gosh, like you could get hit on the head and clubbed to death because you talked to someone's wife?
I mean, yeah, I would say, let me put it this way. So the best literature, there's a guy at University of Texas, Austin, named David Buss, who's written a couple of great books about human mating and mating behavior from an evolutionary perspective. I would recommend for your readers, for your listeners, to take a look at that book, because he aggregates a tremendous amount of evidence of patterns of data that are consistent with the evolutionary point of view, and I think there is quite a lot of it. And some of it's sort of intuitive, and you could say, yeah, my grandmother could have told me that, but you'd say, well, but we have data and we have evidence, and maybe your grandmother would have been wrong. So yeah, some of the sort of low hanging fruit in the evolutionary approach, to a large extent, was the mating stuff and the sex difference stuff. And again, some of probably a lot of that could have been predicted, but not everyone's an evolutionist psychologist, and not everyone sort of had that point of view. Just to give you one example, like in the context of jealousy, which I mentioned earlier. So David Buss and his colleagues have shown that if you're a male of any species, then the big cost to you is if a female who's your partner mates with has sex with another individual, and if you're a female, the big cost is if you're the one who's investing in you diverts investment. And so what that predicts is that male jealousy should be aimed at the sexual interaction, whereas female sexual jealousy should be more activated by the potential loss of the investment or the loss of the emotional part. And there's a ton of data that is consistent with that prediction. So, and that is something that I think you do need an evolutionary approach to sort of, to dug out. So I do commend that literature. I think is pretty solid, but there's disagreement about everything.
When it comes to like trade-offs with modern like dating strategies, do you have any like comments on how the world's either evolving or what it was like before our ancestors kind of dealt with, and what's the if there is an ideal scenario, or what maybe the future holds?
I'm a little bit too relaxed. So first of all, I've been off the dating market for some time, thankfully. So I don't have personal experience with it. I will say this. This is the one thing I think that, you know, I think the fact that so many people are meeting potential mates on these apps has this really funny feature, which is that it seems like it's an endless, just an endless stream of potential mates. And I think that makes people way more casual about, you know, um, rejecting someone based on one feature. He's less than 6 feet tall. That's a deal breaker. Or, she is a moderate and I'm on the extreme, one side or the other. That's a deal breaker. And I think people have those views because they think that the dating pool is not a dating pool, but it's an ocean. And I think that also means that people are more likely to give up relationships when they stumble. They hit a little rocky patch. They're like, well, let's pop back on the app. And if I had to guess, my guess is that that's probably pushed people too far in the other direction. So, my first thing I said was, don't mess up because there's like no one else there. And now I'm saying, well, there's always whatever. I just think, that yeah, the technology that exposes us to so many potential partners risks us losing sight of the value that other people have because there's the opportunity cost, the possibility that someone better just one swipe away. It's too tempting. So I'm not saying people should settle. I'm saying I worry that relationships have a much more feel of disposability than they used to. And I don't think that's great. And my sense is that's getting worse, not better. There's another thing too, and I have very mixed feelings about this, which is, let's go back to the utopia. So in this world in which you don't really need, in which, there's enough stuff for everyone to go around, maybe there's universal basic income, maybe prices are really low. Um, you know, it, then in the past, one reason that people built relationships together was, economic, right? Two incomes, or in some cases, one income, or whatever. But that's gone, right? So if the state is going to take care of your needs, then the impetus for a relationship, that's not part of it anymore. And maybe that's good. I'm not saying it's necessarily. I don't know which way it is, but my sense is that, and I think the data back this up. More and more people are thinking, you know what? I'm just going to go it alone. I'm just going to do my thing. Both men and women, by the way. This is not unique to one sex or the other. And in a world in which there's not a welfare state, that might be impossible, right? You might have to have a partner to make it work economically. But in a world in which the state sort of gives you a relationship of last resort, or that, what you know what I mean, like support, even if you're not in a corporate entity with another person. So all of those things, and I don't. I'm very hesitant to put this too strongly. I don't know. I suspect the world in which we build strong monogamous or quasi-monogamous bonds. I think people are going to be happier in that world overall. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, maybe that's just me because I'm in a monogamous relationship. But I have this feeling that we look. There's lots of evidence that humans evolved for monogamy. The jealousy system that we just talked about it is one piece of evidence. Like if the relationships that we were in weren't valuable, we wouldn't get upset. We wouldn't have it designed to make us angry when it was in jeopardy.
Interesting. So because we experience jealousy, or the feeling of trying to distance ourselves from being hurt, with a partner that's maybe taking actions that we don't align with, that's because of jealousy. That's not because of like an early trauma or the kind of attachment style options that are out there. You think it's a evolutionary feature that has evolved from our DNA and from our ancestors?
Absolutely. I think the evidence for an evolved jealousy system is extremely strong. I mean, it looks exactly like what if you were going to design an organism to defend its relationship. And so, what would you do? Well, you would make it really sensitive to evidence that the other person is sort of contemplating another option. And then, what would you do in return? Well, I would probably be a little angry to try to change the incentive structure of that other person to say, if you continue, then I will hurt you. That seems like a really good defense system. And the other piece, we know that people who are jealous up their game. They invest more in the partners, they work on their appearance and so on. The whole thing looks perfectly designed for an organism who is monogamous, who's in a world in which they have to attract and keep a partner. Like the jealousy. I mean, David, again, he wrote a book on this thing. I think the subtitle of the book is something like, why jealousy is required for a world of love or something like that. I mean, he's got a point. Like, it really does look finely designed to maintain a close relationship. And just, by the way, this is my public service announcement. My view is that the claims about what trauma does to people have been wildly overstated. I think that, it's become very popular to explain anything, pretty much anything, by using the word trauma. Mostly it's stuff that someone who I like did that was bad. I say, well, they had trauma. So when your friends do something they shouldn't have done, they have trauma. Like I think it's sort of become the get out of jail free card. It's also become like the pop psychology, go to. Anyway, so don't get me wrong. I think trauma can have lasting effects. I think people who want to look into that should look carefully at the data on it. But this one doesn't look. I can be persuaded to our prior discussion. Like I'm not, whatever. I can be persuaded, but man, there's so much evidence that makes jealousy look so good for this purpose.
Yeah.
It's pretty persuasive.
Well, I'm always open to update my beliefs, and I appreciate the feedback that you're sharing. I'd love to ask about, like, double click in the jealousy aspect. So I don't know if there's anything you can share in your personal relationship or in other data. Is the jealousy, like just a little feeling of jealousy, is the appropriate amount to increase the level of love or attraction? Because then you have a slight pulling away, but not too much where it can threaten or jeopardize the relationship.
Yeah, I mean, so we know from literature, some from at least some self-report data, that one technique that both men and women will do to sort of check to see exactly, to try to assess how much their partner is committed to them is to try to evoke jealousy, with the idea being, which I think is a correct idea. Look, they're not going to get angry. Look, I get angry if you threaten to take something that I really value, right? Like, my artwork or my job or my partner or whatever. That's going to make me angry. And if you threaten to take something and I don't get angry, you're like, oh, well, I guess you didn't really care about that. And so, people can use these. I'm not advocating this, by the way. I don't think this is a great way to deal with your partner, but people do test relationships by, spending a little bit of time with a member of the opposite sex, or, giving cues that you're interested. People do this all the time to suss out the extent to which their partner is really committed. Um, I think that is just a part of human nature, and I get it. You don't really. It can be difficult to know. It's very easy to say I love you, right? It costs me nothing to say that. But if someone is threatening you and I punch them in the face and I risk a jail sentence, well, that's again, going back to economics. There's cheap talk and there's costly signals. It's cheap talk to say I love you, but it's a costly signal to invest and give you flowers and to punch the other guy who was looking at you funny or whatever. Again, I am not advocating any of these things. I'm just saying. I mean, don't you sort of like? I'm not going to use an example of my life, but I would say I have tons of experience with people who say, I didn't realize how much he or she loved me until I saw how they reacted to the fact that Fred liked my Facebook post or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, uh, and that definitely happens too, right? People are using all these cues, including the weird social media stuff. I mean, right? There's a meme about this. Oh, do you love me? Yes, and whatever. And then someone says, well, tell that to the guy who liked your Facebook, whatever. Like people do this all the time. No,
Yeah,
is that
no,
not your
I
experience?
it's definitely bringing up some personal memories. I think what I notice is it's almost like a challenge to see if the alignment is there. It's almost like if you push the boundary a little bit, in the context of her kind of pushing the boundary, it's like, are you stepping up and getting passionate or angry, or stepping um, into a mode of like expressing how much you care, and like a boundary of like, hey, that's not okay. Like that's like this is a crossing of a boundary. Or do you just like kind of let it unfold? And I guess then it almost it then opens up or allows just the dissolution. It's almost like the check. Are we aligning together or are we dissolving together?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I think we all have had personal experiences, and I think we all have this experience where, yeah, if someone doesn't react negatively to some sort of quasi threat, you feel like, okay, well, I guess this is not whatever. And the sad fact is that people do this in relationships all the time. I mean, I was just talking to Josh, so he's the other guy who writes on the Substack that we do, the Living Fossils, and we were talking about the feeling of contempt, and he's a clinician, and he's a very, very talented clinician. He's a great psychologist, and he was talking to me without names about how couples also use contempt to test the boundaries. Um, there you go again with your dumb whatever, which is sort of this pretty contemptuous thing. And then what he tells me is that this is often a test. It's to say, well, okay, let's see how my partner reacts to that. And if they just roll over, that kind of gives me some information about the power dynamic. Like, okay, you're gonna let me just talk to you like that, as opposed to, hey, to challenge that. All I'm saying is, in part, what I'm saying is, relationships are complicated, and there's zero. Humans are there. People are always looking around. That's just a fact of life. Again,
When
like,
you
there's always that
when you're in a
possibility.
situation like that, what is the appropriate thing to do? What is the so in a man's context, the woman says, "Oh, you're doing that again," or holds is doing an expression of contempt. What is the appropriate response?
Yeah. I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I too would be a great therapist. I mean, I think if Josh were here, what he would say is, look, you have to be able to talk about these things openly and honestly, right? You have to be able to say something like, first of all, that's disrespectful. And then there's this question of, if you would you do you want to be in a relationship with someone you don't respect, and would you want to be in a relationship with someone who accepts that kind of disrespect? The next piece is, was it the sort of thing that's contemptuous? And then you can get into this question of the details about how we feel about X, Y, or Z, and should I change my behavior, or should you change your perception of it? But you can't get anywhere unless you get it out in the table. But there's the classic finding that the best predictor of divorce is in fact the frequency with which the partners show contempt for one another. That is the number one predictor of divorce. And you can see why. It's basically saying, I don't value you, I don't respect you. So if you're gonna come out of that, if you're gonna come out of that doom loop, you have to be ready to have a difficult conversation about it. It seems to me.
So if the holding of contempt is the greatest precursor to divorce, the other emotion, the sensation that's experienced is jealousy. Just a little bit of jealousy can be used as a way to determine and spike in your partner where they stand with you, and might be a subtle demonstration of your independence, or like your desire, your honest, maybe subtle desire to evaluate, like, are we really going in the same direction? But too much jealousy might then trigger a moment of it backfires on you, and you end up pushing the
Yeah.
partner away by that action of you trying to see if for them to prove it to you.
My former mentor, Lita Cosmes, used to say, life is not a dress rehearsal. And I guess what I'm saying is, life is hard. Yeah, to figure out exactly how to navigate these things. Like, what is the right, yeah, if a person does something that shows that, they are in demand on the mating market, that can be valuable for them. That can increase the partner's commitment, increase the partner's effort to make the relationship work. But as you say, you fly too close to the sun and there go your wings, right? Like, I mean, and that's the thing about. So what you'd expect is that evolution crafted us to be good at playing games with each other, and it's always right at the edge. Like, there's never going to be, like, if any strategy just worked, we'd all do it, but we don't. We're always in a game with each other. And so what's sort of the optimal amount of jealousy? What's the optimal amount of contempt? It's hard, man. Like, if you knew that, you would, again, you'd be the Buddha or whatever. It's hard, and but that's guaranteed by evolution as a competitive process, right? It's always going to be the kind of thing where, you know, there's it's always going to be hard, because if it wasn't a hard game, then all the genes that played it badly would be gone, and then we'd just be playing against the good players, which is where we wind up.
And I guess in some context, we are the good players. We are the best players that have survived up until now.
Yeah, you're the product of like a tremendously long line of people who navigated life well enough to successfully survive to reproductive age and then reproduce one way or another. And everyone else did too. And like, that's kind of humbling. You think, man, we're competing in this world against, the results of just win after win after win after win. We're all descended from winners, and we're all competing with other winners. And so it's no wonder it's complicated.
I think that's a profound new way to look at the world. I think for someone listening, to update your belief that you're actually in a world of the best players, the people that have survived so many generations of hardships to get to this point.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, evolution is a nasty, nasty game, and the sieve of calling out the genes that don't work. I mean, yeah, all of those dead branches. It'd be great to compete against those guys, because they had something that whatever. So I think the nice thing about that is it gives you a little bit of a release of in terms of ambition. Like, oh, okay, I'm not Elon Musk. I'm not the CEO of whatever. I'm not the president. I'm not didn't win a Nobel Prize. Competing against the best of the best of the best, a long line of successful reproduction. Okay, well, that's okay. I think to some extent it's helpful to again not to be too Zen or Buddhist about it, but like, okay, maybe the thing is not to be the best in the universe. Maybe the thing is to be the best person I can be and to bring about the best results, to make other people's lives as good as I have a limited amount of power and capacity to make other people's lives better. Maybe that should be the test. How did I do with that? And that's I think, a gentler standard to live by.
Wow. Rob, that is an incredible message. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Same.
Wasn't expecting the way it landed here. How eloquently it ended. If anybody's listening, kudos and respect for being here with us, because I really have enjoyed this recent kind of discussion on the intimate dating energy relationship and a profound new way to look at the world and all of our brethren, all of our co collaborators that have made it this far.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I'm really glad we had a chance to connect.
Yeah. Thanks for being on the show, Rob.
Thank you.